welcome to Unlatched Mind. Today my guest is returning from our last episode, Dr. Jeremy Sherman. Last time we spoke about, we had a discussion on free will and the determinism or indeterminism of this universe. Could it be deterministic? Is there somebody in control? We touched on a lot of things. I just thought, we had a great conversation. I just think I felt that we needed more time to bring some closure to some things. Now, in hindsight, after this discussion, I don't think we closed out anything, but, at the end of the day, it's not really the point. There's really is no closure on a lot of these topics. I think the point is more about the journey and the questions and the conversation. But anyway, I enjoyed this conversation just as much as the last. So let's jump back in. With that, I give you Dr. Jeremy Sherman. Well, Dr. Sherman, first of all, thanks for doing this part two. I feel like from last time we dove in for initially, and I had I would say 30 things to talk about. I feel like we touched on 2 or 3 or 4 of them, and then we went tangent left, tangent right, and I loved the conversation. And then but we hung up, and I said, "Oh my gosh, I feel like there's so much more we could have touched on." So then I reached out to you and said, "Hey, let's do a part 2." You're like, "Let's do it." And a few days later, here we are. So I guess the one thing I don't think I just want to draw closure on, then we can jump into, we'll see where it goes. But where we left it last time, I feel like it was Laplace's demon, and the main theme of last discussion was the iffiness of life, right? Whether or not this whole thing is deterministic. And I think, and I don't know if I put words in your mouth, but the summary of, I think you were basically saying it's not, right? There's no creator, there's no organizer, there's no deterministic being outside of this world saying, you're going to go left, you're going to go right, you're going to determine that you're going to make this decision, this car crash is going to happen then, this earthquake is going to happen then. And we started bringing up, I think I used the layman's example of how I relate to Laplace's demon, which was, imagine the billiard ball analogy, where if you knew all of the physics of the universe, for example,
demon,
yeah, exactly, yeah, and if you knew all the physics of the universe, and you knew the exact trajectory that this giant cue balls coming into this ball, this collection of billiard balls, and assuming that's the Big Bang, just for the sake of argument, that thing hits. Why couldn't some being determine exactly what is going to happen from that point, on to and be able to tell the future and any given present event and all future there from that point on. And then one thing I was thinking of, and I think you touched on it last time, and we didn't really dig into, and this is kind of where I thought we would dig into a little bit, is, so assume for the sake of argument that's true, where every particle, every quark, every little detail, every wave, if you're in the quantum world, is potentially deterministic based on just pure physics, assuming there's some superpower above this whole world, and that billiard ball hits, and then it hits that giant stack of balls, and you overlay that to the actual Big Bang. Every little particle in the universe from that point on is quote unquote deterministic, just based on just physics. But what we didn't really, I think you were getting to, and maybe I didn't fully appreciate at the time, but what if you dropped a bunch of humans in there that have quote unquote free will? And maybe they don't, or maybe they do. If they have free will and nothing's deterministic, how do those humans, or those people, or those things interacting with those particles affect the trajectory of what could be deterministic if those people weren't even there? And I think we kind of sort of touched on that, but maybe didn't.
Yeah, no, I did, and let me go back to it and frame it up for you. From this perspective, it's one perspective. There are 2 separate questions. One is whether some external being observing everything could predict from one moment to another, and that's a kind of epistemological determinism. That is, that you would be able on the outside to analyze everything and determine what will happen next and next and next and next.
Right.
The other one is about the ontological quality of that. That is, whether existence itself is deterministic. So regardless of whether you had someone tracking it or not, your billiard ball model doesn't need someone tracking it. The billiard ball model is just about the state of physics. And yes, for a long time we thought, you could say before the introduction of the quantum quandaries, the questions that we're now dealing with because of quantum mechanics, if you just talk about classical mechanics, there was a sense of determinism. Now, I don't want to get too far into the question of ontological determinism. That is, whether you could have, whether the universe at its origins is deterministic. It's a very complicated area, but I do want to talk mostly about the second one, which is someone wanting to track it all so that someone could predict what will come next after moment after moment after moment, because that's closer to what's interesting, and I think it's close to a question you mentioned. What's interesting to you and what you mentioned in the last one, which whether this is a simulation. That is the demon is not just tracking as an observer, the way that, let's say, we watch TV and don't have any influence on what we're watching. The observer is observing because he wants to observe, because he wants to predict something. For example, the ability to predict what the stock market would be able to do deterministically. Here you get into a strange loop problem. There are so many angles to this, but here, the strange loop, I just want to talk about two pieces of this to keep it fairly simple at this point. One is that if the demon intervenes in the world, then the demon also has to be able to track its own behavior, because the intervention would also have, remember, we think of Laplace's demon as like a computer. Well, a computer is as close as humans have ever designed to something truly deterministic. It's not deterministic, but it's darn close. That's what it's engineered for. That's why we digitize down to zeros and ones. We don't want the iffiness in there. We love computers because they are so reliably unhuman-like. They do what when we program them, they do what we tell them to do, and they stay doing that for a long time. That's closer to determinism. Well, okay, so if you've got a computer that also has to track its own behavior and then track its tracking of its own behavior, you get into the problem I mentioned before. It's a strange loop problem. It's an eating your mouth problem. And I do have that whole video, it's a video. It's actually mostly an audio with a little bit of imagery to dress it up. But it's a video in which I'm imagining a conversation between God and a mere mortal, where the mere mortal wants some guidance from God and assumes that God is omniscient. That is, that God can answer all questions about what she should do. And God admits to her that he can't, because, I mean, he'd like to be able to, but he can't, because if he intervenes in that way, he also has to track his own mind. He's either outside, like watching it on TV, and has no power over it, or he's inside, in which case there's the strange loop problem. So there's that side of it, but I also want to touch on another side of it. But before I do, let me see if you have a response to that or challenge to that or anything like that.
Well, I guess the only challenge would be, and I think we really quickly touched on this last time. Yeah, I think you mentioned, if this being, if God was going to be able to, step back and observe his creation and all the little things that happen, if he intervened, he'd also have to track his intervening, which
that's right.
by our logic makes no sense, because it's almost like you can't a priori, track what you're about to do before you do it. But I guess my only pushback there would be, well, that's a contradiction only in our understanding of logic and time. But if you're
right.
capital G God, perhaps those domains of time and logic don't exist the way we think they are. So why couldn't he intervene in what we think is that timeline?
So this gets to something very fundamental for me. So I would distinguish between two kinds of two stances in the world. One I would call infallibilism, and the other is fallibilism. I am a devout fallibilist. I am more committed to fallibilism than anything else.
Ditto, ditto.
Fallibilism is a
Yeah.
term coined by Charles Sanders Peirce, a philosopher, American philosopher, turn of the century. And I translate it as, no matter how confident I am in a bet, I am still more confident that it is a bet. That is, I believe that there is not a single assessment any human or any organism could ever make that isn't guesswork. That is, there's nothing that you could fix absolutely. No matter how many factors you take into account, there's still a chance that some factor you didn't take into account would change everything. And
Right.
And I'm not paralyzed by that. There are a lot of schools of thought, actually, that move towards what I would call pejoratively the doctrine of foregone inconclusion. That is, you can't know anything because of this. It's elliptical. It's the extreme version of doubt, and it's got a long history and pedigree. So you can say, well, you don't know that for sure, and that's true. I'm not bothered by that. It's
Right.
I'm not interested in. I'm not paralyzed by the possibility that I could be wrong. I couldn't afford to be. I have to actually make decisions, and nor am I willing to assert that any bet is as good as any other bet. No one lives like that. Some people talk like that, but mostly they talk like that so as to wedge a little room in for their idea. So, for example, anybody who says, well, you don't know that climate change is true, it could be wrong, they're not saying it because they're actually skeptics. They're saying it because they want to make some room for what they believe. We're getting a taste of that from the Republican Party these days. The rhetoric these days basically takes the form of, since there's the slightest possibility that this is a misinterpretation to our disadvantage, it is probable that it is a misinterpretation. They slide right over those two different versions of maybe. So there's a rhetorical use for that. And look, if anybody wants to believe that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnificent, that is all powerful, all knowing, and all beneficial, all good, they're entitled to believe that. I don't bet on it based on what I know, and I could be wrong, and it doesn't bother me that I'm wrong. It is usually, so I think of the culture wars these days as largely a battle between infallibilists who think that life is guesswork, and fallibilists who think that life is guesswork, and infallibilists who want to actually claim that they have godlike powers, perhaps through association with him, perhaps through some revelation they had, perhaps through some insight that feels powerful, and they are simply willing to talk as if they know and everybody else should doubt because they know. So that's a whole branch of my work, is paying attention to that. Now, so yes, God could work in mysterious ways. There's an interesting debate that happened long ago. There was the first dissenters against the Catholic Church were not the Protestants. The first big one was called the Cathars. And they had a wild belief system, and they were a challenge and threat to the Catholic Church. And at one point, the Catholic Church called them into a meeting. This is before the Catholic Church actually murdered all of them. But it called them in, and the Cathars asked, well, why is there evil in the world? And the Catholics said, well, God works in mysterious ways. And the Cathars said, you can't have it both ways. You can't both assert a bunch of things about what God does, and then when you don't know, just hover on that, base hug on, well, he's obviously So there's a way in which people will dodge in and out of the uncertainty, but mostly to serve them. So just keeping in mind, everything I ever say is a guess that could prove wrong. And knowing that has been extraordinarily liberating in my life. I try to make the best guesses possible. The best guesses within what we call bounded rationality. That is, I have to also allocate my concentration, so my attention, so that I'm definitely not optimizing. I'm doing what they call satisficing. That is, I'm coming up with the best solution. But in some areas, I'm extremely fussy. I'm a total snob in trying to make some kinds of guesses. And then, but do I ever think those guesses have crossed the line into certainty? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So the only thing I'm absolute about is that there are no absolutes. I am an absolute anti-absolutist. And that's a hypocritical statement, and I mean it to be. That is, for me, the fundamental is that, and this actually would get us into questions about ontological determinism, whether the universe itself is determinism. But my research so far has me convinced that the bedrock of reality is constantly pulls the rug out from under itself. And I actually think that's beautiful. And it doesn't relieve me from any of the guesswork of life. And I want to say also that fallibilism has by far the stronger pedigree. Origins of life research, the stuff I work on, you're discovering that it's been guesswork all along. And there's nothing about language that would liberate us from the guesswork that has been going on. I mean, when you think about effort or trying, that implies it. There's no formula. Like I said last time, I think the hardest news from Darwin is that there's no formula. You can come up with a good one, and the next moment it won't work anymore. This is guesswork. And I find that extraordinarily liberating. I know plenty of people who find it absolutely terrifying.
Well, so I guess I find it both. And having a podcast with you right now, I find it extremely liberating and exciting, and just you get a jolt of adrenaline just thinking about the fact that there's no limit to digging into the intellectual possibilities of where that could go. On the flip side, if I'm leading a nation, if I'm leading a country, if I'm leading the world, say, that notion, that theme, I don't know how that wouldn't convey to to order and confidence in folks that that would rally up to that it's great in academia maybe, or in podcasting, or in philosophy or psychology, whatever you want to call it, but at some point we need to ground ourselves and anchor into something. And the problem is maybe that something is not, I think that's what we're all calling for.
You're absolutely right.
So
yeah, you're right. And it doesn't just take being a leader. If you spent all of your time fussing endlessly and always looking at the next dilemma that arises from the prior solution, you wouldn't get anything done. Right, and yes, right. that is something that you could possibly enjoy if you're in academia, but you actually have to get things done. So we do make committed bets, many of them, most of them actually at the unconscious level. You can one way that this is also handled, Peirce made this comment. He's responding to Descartes, who argues that you should doubt everything. And Peirce says, dude, you can't doubt everything. You don't even know everything you assume. How could you possibly doubt everything? That's a ridiculous notion. So no, I have to get up in the morning and make a commitment. So this is a famous tension in the life and social sciences. It's called explore versus exploit. Explore for better solutions, or exploit your found solutions. I mean, you're married, you got kids. This is a commitment, and it's and I've got all sorts of commitments. The idea that we should be endlessly open-minded is certainly not the point. We have to make commitments. I am very happy to be very close-minded on all sorts of things. There's a variety of things. You're just not likely to budge me lifelong, no matter how hard you try. And someone can insult me and call me close-minded, and I want to be close-minded about the better bets.
Right.
So remember, this is not the doctrine of foregone in conclusion, which has become extremely popular in the form of postmodernism, which is that there is no ground. There actually is ground. That is, I will die if I don't interact well with, you call it a simulation. I don't care what we call it. You call it reality, you call it a simulation. There's a variety of things that if no matter how hard I insist or struggle against them, it wins. Right. So I call them reality, and I'm trying to guess well at what reality entails.
Right.
And it affords me a lot of freedom. And I want to say also, this is the second part that I want to touch on. I mentioned this the other day. free will versus determinism is a bad framing for the question, and it's no wonder to me at all that we've been running in circles, yielding very little from it. The issue is will. Molecules don't have will. I know people who think they do, but molecules act radically different from what we do. And by we, I mean all organisms. That is, all organisms make effort to survive and reproduce, which takes effort because everything in the universe is degenerating. So it takes ongoing hustle to do this. So that effort, that will, if we don't have an explanation for what it is, how do you expect to get anywhere on the question of free will versus determinism? If we don't understand this radical difference that no one can deny, even the guys who write articles about how the consciousness is just an illusion, that kind of thing, it's an illusion to whom? Consciousness is just stuff written on the mind. Read by whom for what? There's obviously a difference between inanimate and animate matter. We are sloppy about it in our everyday conversations. I mean, I'll talk about an idea having impact on me. Well, it's a physics term. Ideas don't have impact the same way as physics does. If we don't know what will is, what effort is, what striving is, what the struggle for existence is, we can't possibly begin to understand how it plays out in the world. And I think we do have an explanation for will. That is, the research that I have followed most closely and have contributed to, I think is a real good guess at how will comes out of chemistry, with no smoke and mirrors, not declaring it, not positing terms that I can't explain, but actually explaining how you'd ever get chemistry that's trying to reduce its likeliness of falling apart. If we have an explanation for that, we notice that at least at the level of living beings, determinism doesn't work. Because will doesn't work that way. Will doesn't work like billiard balls. I can model it with billiard balls, but it doesn't work like it.
So what is that explanation of will that your work is shown? Because that's
well. So let me translate to the totally accessible idea of effort. So that is, I can stand outside of something and say, well, this plant wills to live because I see it, its roots busting through the cracks, trying to find a way. And I could say trying is maybe too conscious or emotional, and I don't want to apply that to the tree, to the plant, but I do want to say it is making effort. And it's pretty straightforward to say that. That is, if you want to say that organisms are trying to live, all of them, that's a fair statement. They're not just durable, they're trying to live. Okay, so the question becomes, what is trying? Or let me use the more neutral term, effort. That is, a lot of organisms make effort without knowing or feeling their effort, but they're still working. Effort is a kind of work. It's not using a different kind of energy. The fuel I burn is the same kind of fuel that could be ignited. I mean, I could burn my toast, right? But or I could burn it internally and use it for something. So it's not a different kind of energy. So, and the question then becomes, I would pose it this way: effort is something different from nothing but chemistry. It's not added to chemistry. It's got added consequences, but you look at everything going on in your body. Everything in it is pure chemistry. It conforms to the laws of chemistry, and yet it's not the same as what a body does when it's dead, when the effort is gone. So here's the huge mystery that I think is getting skirted in so many different arenas. The one that I've concentrated on with Terence Deacon for 23 years. Effort is something different from nothing but chemistry. What is it, and how did it emerge? Not did it emerge, not what am I going to call it if it emerged, not using emergence as an explanation. How, with no smoke and mirrors, do you ever get effort out of chemistry? And our answer is that it's a reduction in possibilities. That is an unlikelification. You get a chemical process that by accident reduces the likelihood of entropy increase. And that would be the wimpy beginning of life. Doesn't look like life as we know it, but it would start that way. And so that's why we've got a model for how that works, how that came about. So now I have and I could detail it out. I actually produced a video today that gets at it, and I have other videos, 3-minute videos that give a short version. I also have a book with Columbia University Press that explains it in more detail. And then Terry has a book that's 3 times as large that explains it in still more detail. But it's actually a pretty simple model. Not as simple as some people would like it, and not as convincingly alive as some people would like it, because a lot of people would like to start with RNA that is being read by something. We think that's too complicated to come spontaneously out of chemistry. But we do have an explanation that ramps all the way up. So now let me just apply it to your situation or mine. Let me take mine just to keep it local. An organism, to prevent itself from degenerating, that is, to falling apart, petering out, has to make some basic effort. It basically has to regenerate in real time. So it has to maintain its capacity to prevent degeneration.
Like faster
my
than
first
decay.
priority
Yeah,
is preventing my own degeneration today, so that I can continue to prevent my own degeneration tomorrow. Right. Okay. So think about it this way. I get up in the morning, I go out to work. I could be doing all sorts of things. I could dither. Remember, that's sort of where we were a minute ago when we were thinking about pure open-mindedness and how you wouldn't get anything done. No, instead I constrain my work. I limit my work down to what? What most fundamentally? The work that I need to do so that tomorrow I can continue to constrain my work. Self-discipline, self-control, regenerating the money necessary to keep a roof over my head. One of the main things I have to do is prevent the influence of things that would degenerate me faster.
Reducing entropy,
on my
reducing
back, all
entropy,
of this sort of stuff. So of all the things I could do in a day, that's the first priority, is self-repair and self-protection. In fact, those have to happen before self-reproduction, because I can't self-reproduce if I've already degenerated. My job number one is to prevent self-degeneration. And so the way we think of it, simply, without describing the chemical process by which we think it happens, we think that a self-making effort is a constraint that channels energy into work that regenerates the constraint. What do I mean by constraint? It's processes that limit what happens, that make some things less likely and therefore others by default more likely. That would be the origins of will from our perspective.
So from the individual, so does that scale from the individual molecule and interaction with molecules all the way up to you and I getting out of bed in the morning, to your example?
Not quite. It's a dynamic, which means that it's a population of molecules of particular kinds doing particular work. Interacting in a certain way. They're not doing work. They're not trying. Molecules don't try. They don't try. Molecules don't try. But you can get a dynamic that is a kind of interaction that will be self-constraining in a way. It's not a self yet, but it happens to constrain things. So I think I touched on this example to illustrate it. Think of molecules as a bunch of people threading around each other in a crowded space. So this is basically a nuts and bolts explanation of self-organization. Self-organization is a major buzzword these days. And yet a lot of people who employ it can't explain what exactly is happening. They can describe it, but they can't explain it. So I'm going to explain it. So there's a square in the middle of town, and it's empty because it's at nighttime and nobody's walking through it. And if you want to get from point A to point B across it, you take the path of least resistance, which is straight through the middle. You take the shortest path, which is, in this case, the path of least resistance. Now imagine that it's noon and everybody's crossing this way and that, people threading around each other. You're threading your way through the crowd, and you'll encounter some congestion. And the congestion actually limits your path. And you'll end up with a path that is, it's the path of least resistance still. You're flowing down the path of least resistance like water molecules do or something. But it's not going to be the same one you could have taken at midnight because there's a bunch of congestion in there. Well, the congestion is actually constraining the behavior. That is what I just described is exactly how whirlpools happen. Turbulence is it's a crowd. It's a crowd of molecules, none of them trying to get anywhere, but all of them being pushed and pulled by the currents they're in. They are more like your billiard balls, but there's going to be congestion. And things will be threading around that congestion down other paths of least resistance. The spiral is the path of least resistance for an excess of throughput. That is more water flowing through than can be handled efficiently by the turbulence. And so it falls increasingly into paths of least resistance. And I have to make clear, it's not trying to any more than a ball is trying to fall down the path of least resistance. So that's self-organization. It doesn't explain life, but it does show you how you can have a reduction in possibilities that is not imposed from the outside. The whirlpool spiral isn't imposed on it. It's happening because of that congestion, and the congestion is not a thing doing work, and yet it does reduce possibilities. So we do see that in dynamic interaction, you can have some things becoming some paths becoming less likely and others becoming more likely. And so now I haven't bridged, and I won't bridge here. I mean, it's too much. But if you take self-organization, it's not alive. That water's going to drain out of the bathtub faster. The crowd's going to clear faster when people are taking these paths of least resistance. That is, if there's basically flows. I mean, just think about it like, imagine this: you left something on an airplane and you have to go back against the current of all those people who are leaving the airplane.
Yeah.
That's the kind of work that doesn't happen. You'll end up kind of going with the flow, and the flows will get stronger and stronger as more things go with the flow. That's self-organization. And our model basically has to bridge from that which is not alive to a process that further constrains, such that you get what I described a minute ago, which is a constraint that channels energy into work that regenerates the constraint. And it doesn't even regenerate the same constraint. As long as the constraint continues to be, you could say, self-regenerating, then it stays alive. And I want to say that from the beginning of this, what I'll simplify and call a self-regenerative constraint, to your very existence and your children's existence, there has been a complete continuity over 3.8 billion years. That is, this self-discipline, self-regenerative self-discipline, that's my definition for alive, and you come from a long line of it. And yes, it has changed a lot, but what has never been lost in all that time is its self-regenerative constraint. And when we die, when a life terminates, that self-regeneration is what disappeared. The self-regenerative constraint, the constraint. So you can say it's self-regenerative self-discipline, and that's what disappears, and that's why your body's material can be in way more configurations when you're dead. So what is the will then? It's not something added to chemistry. It's a reduction in possibilities. It's an unlikelification of dying. It's what it is.
Now, are there things that we do as humans that contradict that? Like, are there things that we do out of love, and we
totally.
we go left and right, and we get on a plane and we do this for a loved one that we care for, that has almost no impact on our life because we feel we should care for them.
You can die for king and country.
Right.
So this is
yes.
Remember, the three areas where I work is origins of life.
Yes, right.
What changes with language, and basically how to not be a jerk. I mean, those are the three areas I work in, and the third one is based on the second one. That is, language changes things a whole lot. You become a suicide bomber.
Right.
So first of all, I should say that there's a whole lot of headroom. We have a lot of latitude in how we behave, let's say, compared to other organisms. So if they have, I won't call it free will, because it's not free. It's heavily influenced by, we have to fit our circumstances, but it's at least interpretive, and interpretation is more iffy than cause and effect. So once there's life, there's interpretive will, but with language, it explodes. It's just It's a carnival and clusterfuck. It's a mess. What you get with human life, including all sorts of ways of giving ourselves pep talks. Also, we can identify ourselves with all sorts of things, real and imaginary, in ways that other organisms can't. And not only that, we have created for ourselves a immediately safe environment. It may not be safe in the next 40 years, but it is certainly safe right now. That is, I have all sorts of latitude. I have a roof over my house. I could walk around it naked and I wouldn't have to worry about degeneration. I mean, I've got clothes. I've got all sorts of things. So that gives me extra leeway. I can be way freer than others and way better at denial. That is, I can live in a gated community. I can amass an enormous amount of money so I can believe whatever I want and no one can tell me otherwise. We are a dangerous creature because of that, and we're also a visionary creature. We're a hoot. I mean, for comic relief, we are the species to watch. We are just a riot, and also deeply impressive. I love that line. Shakespeare has a song he wrote, "What a piece of work is man," and he's talking about how noble we are in reason and our faculties. But I also like it the other way around. We're a total piece of work.
Totally disagree. I totally agree there. I mean, no disagree. We are certainly interesting. Where was it? I mean, so does this general framework apply whether we are it, whether there's aliens looking at us, having the same discussion on us, or whether does what, because we talked about the simulation concept last time, and that for me,
beautiful. And this question is beautiful. It's right where you need to go next.
So does this scale throughout that infinite? Because we're talking, and most folks listening are probably like, well, we're the top of the food chain, and everything we're talking about is us and below, right? Humans are the peak of molecular evolution, and then everything that we've come from from the 3.8 billion years to now. What if that was just a microcosm of the greater, and 3.8 billion years in our time was a speck on the time frame of some greater 16 trillion years or whatever it might be? Does this basic approach you're discussing scale to that span as well? Or does it not even make sense?
So let me make two connections. One is that's a very alluring idea, which is that it's a possibility that we this is fallibilism brought to
right.
to almost ecstatic levels, yes. Which is we may so not know what's going on. We could be completely clueless.
Yep.
And once again, one could exploit this. I'll use that term again, the doctrine of foregone in conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like about it is that it's a doctrine. It's a paradox. That is, remember, I just love the paradoxes. So what it is if someone says, really, there is no reality, or let me tell you absolutely that you don't know. Those are great, because they point out, they pull the rug out from under themselves
immediately, right? As soon as they can hit the period.
So really, there's no reality, and no, like I say, mostly it's used by people. It started out in academics, but by now it's actually in politics. The sense that it's just a game, that we can't know anything for sure, so I might as well just assert my own beliefs as strong as anybody, because it's a kind of a cynical nihilistic view. But so there's certainly that dazzle, and there are plenty of people who do the red pill, blue pill game who are basically doing that. Right. That is, they are basically reestablishing a doctrine, and there's a bit of there. You could say this is all built on. I mean, the earliest version of this virtual reality concept is Plato's cave, of course, and I think you can come out of that cave two different ways. I think I mentioned this last time. One is you come out and you say, wow, I was deluded before, but now I see reality. I once was lost, but now I'm found. And that's sometimes implied at least that's often implied in interpretations of Plato, but to some extent he may have meant it as well. That is not the response I think is healthy, sane, or anything like that. And it is used over and over by dictators and fools. I call it, I once was lost, but now I'm blind. Because really, what happens if you discover that you've been fooled is that you discover that you're foolable.
Right. Right.
Not that it's not, what makes you think this isn't the next trick being played on you.
Right.
And Descartes had things to say about that, but I actually want to get back to your question. So what if this is all a simulation willed by some other species? Well, there's that word again, will. Okay, so it's willing too. One way or another, we have to deal with the difference between things that will and things that don't. And maybe we don't have the ground on which to do that because we're so clueless that we don't realize that we're just puppets in, the last scene of Men in Black 2. It's a beautiful scene where where they're inside of a locker. It's this nested hierarchy, but we're this season's people. We have to deal with the best evidence we've got if we want to play these games at all, and if we don't want to play this game, if we don't want to try and figure out what's more real than what, you're excused from the table. You don't have to join this. There are plenty of other things to do in life. It's no problem. In fact, you certainly don't need to explore all of this to have a good life. But to the extent I still come down to your point just a minute ago, which is, regardless of whether we're a simulation by whom, for what, still corners you with the difference between things that make effort and things that don't. And if we're not dealing with that question, we're dancing around that question, and we can have a very entertaining time asserting things. I think a lot of this goes on in academics, which is that they don't have to deal with that question because they can just come up with different models that assume effort without ever explaining it. But if you actually want some method by which to figure out which theory is more accurate, you really need to know what effort is and how it emerged from chemistry. And once you have that, I think you get a whole lot of grounding. It helps you distinguish between what's a delightful fantasy, just beautifully entertaining and wonderful, and what's probably more realistic. And I need both. I need fantasy in my life. I believe in optimal illusion. I want to kid myself where it helps and not where it hurts.
You're right.
So a big chunk of my work is trying to make the world safe for escapism. Because my only problem with tyrants is not that they have delusions. Heck, I got delusions too, and I love them. I mean, they're part of how I keep sane. The world is too much. But my problem is that they make a bid for a bigger buzz by insisting that their delusion is true and that they know it infallibly. That's where they become terrifying. I mean, man, I watch fiction, I masturbate. There's all sorts of things I do that are basically escapism. My optimal is you go do that stuff, but with a return ticket to reality in your pocket. Right. Take your flights of fancy, but try to continue to guess what's a useful or entertaining vision and what's a real vision for your own sake. It's and for everybody around you as well.
Do you now? This is getting a little personal. So just tell me to back off. So do you feel?
I think I just demonstrated I'm shameless.
Yeah, I mean, you just were masturbating. You must be the only guy on earth that masturbates. That's weird. I don't know why you would do that.
Yeah,
I can't imagine you do that. But you're right. That's right. No, but no, but do you feel, if you were, because to the last episode you discussed a little bit of, you shared a little bit about your upbringing and some of your
my peculiar life.
Exactly. And you're very you're very open about that, and I think certainly appreciate that, and you actually have a very good perspective on it. If you were, I don't know, born into a different family and were a family of, I don't know, coal miners, and you were struggling, and you had that upbringing, do you? Now, obviously, you're very intelligent. And this is, I'm casting your assessment on what is reality, and I'm kind of extrapolating on anyone with giving your assuming the same level of intellect and whatnot. Do you feel your upbringing, your ability to kind of, I would say, meta yourself, remove yourself from day to day because you have that luxury of, I don't have to pay a bill, and the things that you explained last time. Are some of us, I would say, that don't have the luxuries that maybe you grew up with,
Yeah.
are we hindered? Are we handcuffed to more reality? And I say reality meaning the day to day. Does that keep a lot of folks
Yeah.
in this world that maybe you wouldn't have this same meta approach to
Oh,
everyday?
I
You know,
I absolutely, it would be arrogant as hell
mm,
for me to assume that this is my intrinsic nature. No, it is. Uh, so so this is extreme because it implies determinism. But my watchwords is, if I were you, I'd be doing exactly what you're doing. I mean, if you follow, so that can sound deterministic. I don't exactly mean it, but I like to lean that way. No, I assume that this is all luck.
mm,
It's just a better bet than me assuming anything else. And also, it could be completely wrong. You can't play in this field without the chance that you will have spent your entire life barking up the wrong tree.
right.
You just can't.
Mm,
That is, you can't play in science and philosophy and assume that somehow you're exceptional and you're actually going to have nailed it. No, that's the game is like that.
right.
It's you. So this entire life could have been not only wrong but counterproductive, and yet from my perspective, it's a good bet and I like it. That's about all I can say is that I like it.
Mm,
And would I be able to make this bet? No, I know myself from prior periods of life when I needed. Before I realized, this was only about 8 years ago, I realized that I actually didn't need status anymore. The status is absolutely essential for keeping food on the table. But beyond that, and so it's very easy to get confused about how much of your status is this that you never quite got enough when you were a kid,
mm,
and you're still seeking it, versus how much of it is because you need to keep food on the table.
right.
And the, I have a good friend who's an old man by now. He's 87. It's Dan Ellsberg, who was the guy who exposed the Pentagon Papers. He also founded the field of behavioral economics.
Hmm.
And he says the main thing he learned in his entire life is that people can be as stupid as they need to be in order to keep their jobs.
Yes.
And he's not a cynical man. He's a lovely man and incredibly game for exploration at 87 and exploration, real exploration. The guy doesn't pull rank at all. I mean, so he's quite the character. But and I would extend it beyond that. People can not think whatever they can't afford to think in order to maintain whatever circumstances they depend upon. And by the way, that bridges over to my definitions of two words that are often not seen as together, which is love and addiction. I think that love and addiction in practice are the same behavior. The main difference is whether we think that whether we predict they'll turn out well or not. And my definition of them is doing dedicated, that is constrained work to maintain something that you're dependent upon. In either case, that's what I think is going on. That is, of all the things I could do, if I love someone, of all the things I could do, I will tend to constrain it down to what I have to do. That is the dedicated part. Dedicated would mean in this case limiting, self-control, focus, doing the things that maintain that which I depend upon. So by this definition, I love the grocery store. I no longer have the ability to grow my own food, so now I have to do dedicated work to maintain my access to grocery stores because I'm dependent upon them. So you can measure it by if I lost access to them, if my girlfriend dumps me, I'm not half the man I used to be. That is, there's a fundamental way in which, if you're dependent by it, you can measure it by what happens if it's not there. And obviously, there are alternatives. This actually bridges you over into economics, because I'm not in love or doing dedicated work to maintain any particular grocery store, because there are lots of them. And there is this even in the dating world. You take Sally, I'll take Sue. Ain't no different. Twixt the two was an old song. I mean, so there's fungibility. And the fungibility is part of the indeterminacy as well. That is, if you had a choice between two jobs and you could not tell a difference between them, you would take one job over the other. then you'd become addicted or dedicated or loving of it, and it would shape you from then on. So now, is that billiard balls? Not to me, it isn't.
So
A tiny difference can make a huge difference in the human realm, and doesn't happen as much in physics.
So the definition, when I was just going to say the definition of meaning, when and again, so full disclosure, so I love talking to atheists and others, but I'm pretty much a Christian, and I love for me, this is, and some folks would be like, why are you having an atheist talking? Why are you talking to an atheist? And for me, I love it. It's like, this is not hurting my faith. This is making me smarter about certain things. And if it challenges certain things in my head and I got to go research, well, that's even better. And I'll go to bed at night and I will pray and I'll figure it out. And if not, well, then I got to figure that out too. Right. But so the meaning, when you go through your, and I don't know if you have your circles are mostly atheists or mostly, some faith.
Because I'm dealing with these questions, I end up dealing with a lot.
I would imagine, right? People. Yes, right. So the definition of meaning, that is there, quote unquote, meaning that I would say supersedes all the different belief systems. I have sometimes a trouble with, and I got to be honest, a lot of the atheists that I talk to, and especially on this podcast, the joy of life is not absent at all, which would, to be honest, in some of my Christian circles, they would almost, I would say, the fallacies that an atheist would have no joy of life, they have no meaning. I don't find that to be true in any way. I find, just speaking to friends like you you are more joyous and you are energetic about and find purpose in life as much as anyone that I would know. And it's interesting. It's like, but you're going to go through, you were born, you're at age 0, you're going to die at some age, say 110. I'm going to give you a lot of extra years there just in case. Just
thanks.
Not to jinx you. So I'm going to buffer that a little bit. So your at the end of the day, your purpose was to do what? Was it to have this conversation and share information? And then, like, what is the...
this is great.
I mean,
this
what's
is great. So I think most meaning is more local than we think, but we can get a whole lot of local meaning from positing a global meaning. But the meaning that I think gets people out of bed tends to be more local than cosmic.
Sure.
There was a time when I was paralyzed about my ultimate meaning, but by now I actually don't have that feeling. And part of it was actually recognizing that the idea of living for an ultimate end, that is for a grand funeral or for getting into heaven, or let me set aside the heaven thing for a moment, just talk about a grand funeral where everybody loves me, a little absurd, because by the time I'm an old man, I'm likely to be senile enough that if I'm grumpy, I'll come up with a terrible interpretation of what happened in my life. And if I'm cheerful, I'll come up with, and both of them will be optimal illusion.
Right.
I mean, I actually can count on, to some extent, becoming a little dimmer as I grow older and a little sloppier in my interpretation. You look at past events, the glorious ones and the terrifying ones. Often what we do when we put them to bed is we stuff a tangle of complicated interactions into a box, label it succinctly, and put it in the attic of our memory. So I think what we're talking about as mobilizing more day to day would be a variety of local meanings. And I love the technology of uplift that the church has developed, that churches have developed. Varieties of ways to make it so people walk into a place of worship and come out re-spirited. And I actually wonder to what extent that drives it as compared to the elaborate cosmology or whatever. But it doesn't matter to me, because actually, if someone goes to church and has that experience of uplift, and comes away believing it's all due to them having nailed reality with a biblical interpretation. A month ago, I spent 3 days in a new community that I'm going to be spending Christmas with, fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. These guys are way out on the edge, way out. And the jam was fun. We had a great time.
Right.
And they asked me at the end, so what are you? Are you, I asked them, I said, can you guess what I am? And they, well, certainly not an atheist. I had to say, no, I am. I wrote a poem a while ago. It's short, and it's called Optimal Illusion. And it was dealing with the question of whether I could get meaning out of something that I also knew was kind of fictional, or probably fictional. So I'm going to read it to you because it's super short. I think this version of it's right. It's called Optimal Illusion. Can musicians feel the music though they know the notes by name? Can athletes play a death match though they know it's just a game? Could Vargas feel the heat and lust from a pinup he had painted? When materialists know it's glandular, do their love affairs get tainted? When you know it's light on silver screen, the movies seem more pallid. If you see through God to his creator, does your creed become less valid? No, apparently we are able to both see through and believe. What an awesome gift from God this is, our power to self-deceive.
Nice.
For me, the point was, no, you can actually harvest all that meaning out of something and still know that it's a guess. That's the point. I'm fine with all the guesses, and I'm fine with them being a blend of escapism and realism. When I'm watching fiction, I'm making interpretations about what I should take as a deeper meaning about reality and what I should take as some entertaining jive. We're doing this all day long. We're trying to figure out what to skip over as well. That's neglectable, and what you have to take on as real. The problem I think comes from an assumption that unless you truly believe and insist that it's absolutely infallibly true, you don't get the buzz. You don't get the meaning, and I don't buy it. I just don't.
Yeah, I mean, the poem was beautiful, and I would just be totally honest. There's parts of it that I would say, there's factions of most churches that would say, well, that's heresy. You can't say, I think,
no,
right. So half of me while you were reading it, was half of me was like, wow, this is beautiful. It's eloquent. It's and the other half of me is like, oh no, you can't say that.
No, that's totally appropriate. And let me go one step further. I have no problem with them insisting that it's heresy or that I'm a sinner or going to death.
Right.
I only have a problem with their infallibilism. That is it. Look, whatever makes your motor hum. If that helps, and Lord knows a whole lot of our fictionalization comes from vilifying others. From vilifying others is one of the greatest buzzes in the world. I mean, I coined the term this week, I think since I saw you last, psychopurgatives. That is, there are a bunch of ways that you can feel pure not you, but one can feel pure by leveling outrage at others. That is, if I accuse someone of lying, immediately purged from my body instantaneously is any recollection of me lying. The more outraged I am, the more quick and swift the purging. So I mean, there's got to be room for that. I certainly engage in these psychopurgatives, that is disdain or snobbery or whatever. It makes, or shaming and all of that. And then there are whole channels, left and right, that do it. They're basically outrage machines for the purgative effects. And there are plenty of churches that do that too. I don't mean of any particular denomination. I know Jewish people who do this. I know Christians that do this, and I know Muslims that do it. Any religion can do that. That is, some of the meaning comes from being so much better than those people who are damned and doomed to hell. And I don't mind it, but I actually probably find more parallels between that and masturbation than that's the thing. It's totally fine as long as you don't know absolutely.
We can't.
It's the infallibilism that will kill us. We do not know reality absolutely. The infallibilism will kill us. We don't get to dictate reality. And I'm not saying I know what reality is. I'm just saying that the category that we would call real is everything that won't change despite the fact that no matter how hard you insist it should. That stuff, it wins all debates.
Right. Yeah, and that's what religion provides, right? Is that, hey, this book, this is reality and everyone else is wrong. I mean, at the end of the day, that's most
some
provide.
Do and some know better.
Right.
Some know how to wink. That is, they keep up appearances and they enjoy the full buzz, and they know it's not. Shakespeare had a wonderful line about this. It was a poem about love, about his relationship with his girlfriend. When my love says she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies.
Yeah, right.
That's how the sonnet begins, and that's exactly what I'm talking about here. That is, enjoy it,
Right.
bless it, reap the meaning out of it, reap the meaning out of even insisting that you know the absolute truth. But you don't, and you know that.
But at some point, aren't
do you
you
know
overreaching? Aren't you lying? Aren't you just not truthful? You know, at some point, because what you're saying is on point. It really is. You know, I was brought up Catholic, and I looked at a lot of the landscape, and I'm like, you know, I feel like, you know, you had the term cafeteria Catholic, where they just pick and choose what they want to believe, and when the hard stuff,
right, which is a disdain.
Yeah,
that's a term for disdain, for not buying the whole
yeah.
package.
It's like, well, I mean, logic doesn't allow me to get there. And then I found biblical Christianity, and it was more of a hardcore. Well, it is what it is. That the book says it, and that's it. And I don't see a way to take pieces of it and not all of it, because I don't how do you not be a hypocrite? The hypocrisy is you either got to take it and that's it, or you have to. I don't know where that line is, but you know, and that's
wow. Well, that's an interesting point. That's a big leap.
Yeah.
First of all, I assume that all humans are hypocrites. I don't see how you could not be. No, sorry. Let me be clear on this. I do not assume that. I assume that all of us engage in hypocrisy.
True. Oh, humans for sure. Right. But
yes,
now we open that book and we say God wrote it. There cannot be hypocrisy in that, because it's supposed to be infallible, and that's where the dichotomy comes in between us humans and what this book says.
So I just recently read a 1,000-page history of evangelicalism in the United States, and then shortly after that, I read a 1,000-page history of Luther and Erasmus dealing with these questions. And and one of the big questions, one of the big goals is infallibility. And basically I noticed a bridge right over to Gödel's theorem. That is, if you can find any place where it is self-contradictory and therefore undecidable, the whole thing collapses. Any infallible structure will fall apart if you find that. And Gödel found it in math. And anybody who claims they don't find those in the Bible, you can call them a hypocrite, or you can call them rational. So I think it's beautiful, the tension that you're struggling with, or not struggling, enjoying. I mean, I savor my tensions. I savor these dilemmas. You want a kind of logical purity, and you also want this. You want logical exploration or rational exploration, clarity about, so you don't talk out of both sides of your mouth. That is, you want to avoid that, and at the same time you want something infallible. Well, I gave up on that one, but not on the core dilemma that it raises, which is, where do I side on either side? Where do I be closed-minded and where do I be open-minded is a huge question. I want to keep an open mind, but I don't want my brains to spill out. So those tensions are live. But in me, I may be more at home with them.
And
that is, I want to be a hypocrite in the right places, not the wrong places. I want to be deluded in the right places, not the wrong places. I want to lie in the right places, not the wrong places. I want to unite with others in the right places, not the wrong places.
That sounds like what we should all strive for. The problem comes in when you enter the Christian domain and the biblical domain as well. If I'm ebbing and flowing and trying to find my right place in hypocrisy, and that in my little bounding box, as you kind of described just then, one of the consequences I may have is burning in a lake of fire for eternity. So I can't, so then there's this ultimate, I can't just be that free. It's like, really? Is that it? Really? Like, you know what I mean?
Right. No. So, but I did write an article a couple of weeks ago. It was funny. I put out this note on Facebook where I like I said, I just use it as my commonplace book, and I wrote down this note that atheists are just guessing that there isn't a God. It's a guess, just like the Christians are guessing that there is a God, and I, this has been overlooked a lot. That is, there's an assumption that atheists are absolutely certain, infallibly sure that there's no God. Nonsense. If you ask me, I'm an atheist. I just think it's unlikely. How unlikely is anywhere on the fence? If you think it's roughly 50-50, then you're agnostic. Or if you think that it doesn't matter, you're an agnostic. If you're leaning one way or another, you get to call yourself a theist or an atheist. And that's often overlooked. The assumption is that if you guys are at 100 on God's realness, we're at 0. No. I mean, like I say, I'm never at 0 on anything. I'm never at 0 or 100 on anything.
Right.
Why would I be? There's, and that's in a way what I'm talking about. I did ask a friend, delightful fellow who was a Calvinist. I asked him, how confident are you that you have that the Bible is inerrant? Because those guys insist that they're literalists, though I don't actually think they are. But they insist on it. And by the way, you can get a whole lot of mileage out of insisting you are without being it. There's Karen Armstrong, who's a religious scholar, says that religions, the only thing they need to maintain, and she's a theological scholar of high note, the only thing they need to maintain constantly is the insistence that it's constant. They can actually change everything else underneath it over time. I mean, we don't sell our daughters into slavery anymore, that sort of thing. It's fascinating to watch this play out in the Mormon church these days at close range, now that I'm hanging out with a bunch of FLDS people. But you got to guess, and it's working for you. And not only that, Dan Ellsberg's point is related here. You cannot think whatever you need to not think in order to keep the community that you love. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's a bigger piece of this than actually the prospect of you burning in hell. If we think of the variety of possible ways that it could go after we die, none of them impossible, because we actually don't know. I mean, I'll just posit one for an example. There is a chance that after we die, our souls migrate and become gummy worms in the nearest convenience store. Okay, that's a possibility. It's not a likely possibility. Anybody who claims that they are, that it's completely unknowable, I don't think they're being honest with themselves. There's a bunch of them where we just say, well, no, that's just very unlikely. But the idea that you've got this one clear determinist possibility, I don't know. I mean, it's got its advantages. It gives you clarity. It's certainly a leg up on self-control. At an expense, that is, it will control you in a certain way to believe something as clear, decisive, and absolute as that. So it comes at a cost. My people were Jewish, your people were Catholic. We're famous for our guilt. If it's steering me in the right way, I like those assists. I don't mind. I'll give myself fake deadlines to get myself under control in certain ways. The question is, which ones do you want to go with? Which ones? So this is how I would frame it. I can't change myself, but I can usually change my environment so it changes me.
Yeah.
So that could include that I would buy into some dogma that helps me change my environment. And then I have to be careful about shopping among interpretations, shopping among the dogmas, because it could be steering me on the express train to smart or dumb.
Right.
And that's my point. To shop carefully among interpretations is the game here. And that's why I don't want any of them that tell me I have to buy it forever or else I'll burn in hell. That's me personally. But no, I want to pick the ones that motivate me in the right directions, that constrain me in ways I want to be constrained. And I think that if we get absolute about this stuff, it stunts our growth in the shopping. That if I say nobody should ever lie, for example, which is absolutely impossible. I mean, the evidence is in. Humans lie. It will stunt your growth. It'll make you a hypocrite because you're a human and you're going to lie. And it'll stunt your growth on the real question, which is where to lie and where not to lie.
Right.
And the benefit of all that is you can come out of it a pompous ass, confident that you're the only one who doesn't lie, what I'll call a meta liar, lying about one's own lying. No, the real questions are where is this a good move and where is it a bad one? And actually, a Christian nailed this. Niebuhr, it's the wisdom to know the difference between when to use this or that, when to be tactful, when to be honest, would be an example of one. And those are the iffinesses that matter in everyday life to me. I want to be good at shopping among the city, at knowing when to do which. That's for my kids' sake as much as this is a lot.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Let's wrap this up. Seriously, wonderful conversation. I appreciate it.
Sounds good. Pleasure to know you, Vinny.
Jeremy, thanks so much.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. This is Unlatched Mind. See ya.